I like to focus on differentiating lines of evidence. Okay. So the evolutionary model would say that evolution is essentially changes in allele frequencies and populations over time. Okay. Now, the question is, do those changes lead to large scale evolution? I would say no, due to low impact, nearly neutral deleterious mutation accumulation. We'll get into that in a second with Iceman. But to Carlos, you were
Yes.
talking about mitochondrial Eve, Y chromosome Adam.
Yes.
So I'd be curious as to your thoughts on the Y chromosome data, which I would argue genetics has discovered the one Y chromosomal ancestor from whom we've all descended from, Y chromosome Noah. We can get into that for sure. And also the one mitochondrial DNA ancestor of whom we've all descended from. This is based on mutation rates, based on the fact that we have low genetic diversity in both DNA compartments, which means with fast mutation rates and low diversity, it is a trivial amount of DNA differences to account for, really, in just a couple hundred generations. But a strong differentiating line of evidence in order to answer the question of ancestry is the Y chromosome data within the great apes. And so I'll present this, and then Carlos, feel free to respond. So notice here on this phylogeny, this picture and study is directly from the conventional literature. And so these are Y chromosomes of humans and your great apes. Evolutionists would say humans are human great apes, and then your chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans are non-human great apes. Now notice the human Y chromosome and the chimpanzee Y chromosome. Okay, supposedly, according to the evolutionary story, the chimpanzee is our closest cousin. Okay, the human and chimpanzees go back to a common ancestor right here, about 6 million years ago, apparently. Now, when you examine the Y chromosomes of both humans and chimpanzees, firstly, Y chromosomes are uniparentally inherited DNA. Okay, so they're not autosomal DNA, which means you're not really going to get any recombination. You might get a little bit at the tips, but nonetheless, it's a less messy chromosome, okay, because there's no recombination, again, for the most part, scrambling of DNA differences every single generation. Okay, so that's why Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA is a great way to answer the question of ancestry, is we can build these really nice family trees and trace back to common ancestors in the past. Anyways, to make a long story short, when you consider overall gene content, size differences, and architecture, the human Y, and you can see it here on the picture, is only about 35 to 40% the same as the chimpanzee Y. You notice the gene content's totally different. The architecture is different. It's half the size. So right off the bat, you're starting at 50%. And the human Y and the gorilla Y are actually more similar to each other than either are to the chimpanzee Y. And so from a separate ancestry model, this makes sense, because we would argue humans and chimpanzees are not related through common ancestry. But for the common descent model, this poses a challenge. This was not predicted. This was a major surprise. And the question is, Carlos, two questions. What are your thoughts on this? Question two, how do you account for such massive differences in Y chromosome DNA in just roughly 6 million years since the split? Go ahead, take your time.
Okay, so that's a very interesting question. Particularly why I like to watch these videos, especially because I'm not much adept in biology, I would say, in terms of genetics and whatnot. So I like listening to these parts. Where I tend to focus is with regards to physics and quantum physics. Again, I'm not scholarly educated, formally educated in those, but that's generally where I look in. My thing is, what was your first question? I'm going to go there them one at a time. Your first question was, what do I think about?
Yes, basically, what are your overall thoughts on this, just in case this is the first time you're seeing this? And then secondly, how would you from the common descent starting point, how would you address this challenge? Essentially, you can see right on the screen the human Y and the chimpanzee Y. You can go directly in the paper. This is right from the conventional literature. So it says the chimpanzee.
So I think so. It's gonna be kind of tricky because again, I'm not too big on genetics. My thing is, from what I've seen, from what you said, those may be massive differences in terms of what. Those may be massive differences with regards to looking between these species, humans, chimps, gorillas, and whatnot. But again, a lot of biology deals with generality. So when we're comparing that to the totality of the genetic makeup, it seems to me that it's the case that quote unquote massive difference is objectively minor compared to the rest of the similarity that we share.
Well, I would argue, no, Bubbles. I want to finish my point before anyone jumps in. I appreciate that response. We can compare the entire genome. We can compare autosomal DNA. Okay. The point I'm trying to make is the Y chromosome should be relatively more stable. Okay. It does have a fast mutation rate, roughly 1 to 3 per person per generation. And there's really only a few DNA differences in the Y chromosome separating any two people. And I can demonstrate that through Y chromosome phylogenetics. But the point is, it lacks recombination. And so it's less messy, it's more stable, and that's why it's a better chromosome to look at. And notice directly from the paper, they say the chimpanzee Y is only half the size of the human Y. So right off the bat, you're starting with a 50% difference. It says the percentage of gene families shared by these two chromosomes that split roughly 6 million years ago, as I said, is similar to that shared by human and chicken autosomes that split roughly 310 million years ago. They say in the paper, puzzlingly, so they didn't predict this. This was a surprise. It's a puzzle to them. In terms of shared genes and overall architecture, the human Y is more similar to the gorilla Y than to the chimpanzee Y. Okay. So the whole point is, if common descent is true, how are you going to explain such massive chromosomal rearrangements, the addition of new gene families, the size differences, the fact, I mean, how did the chimpanzee Y become half the size since the split? And the last point I want to make, when we actually look at only human male Y chromosomes, Carlos, every single male Y chromosome on the planet, whether it's mine or yours, or if I'm looking at, Otangelo's, Luca's, our Y chromosomes are nearly identical, very little variation. Okay. And yet we have a fast mutation rate. Well, if we go back about 200,000 years to some kind of out of Africa scenario, and we're accumulating mutations every single generation, we should have a lot more diversity if common descent is true. But once we bring in the chimpanzees now, remember, the human Y chromosomes are incredibly homogeneous, little variation. That's what that means, rather than heterozygous. But then you bring in your chimpanzee Y chromosome, and you can see it right here. The audience can see the chimpanzee Y is nothing like the human Y. But if they are our closest cousin, I mean, how is that the case, Carlos?
Well, I would say first off, it's the first issue we would have here would be the fact that yes, they're our closest cousin, but it doesn't necessarily follow that that part of the genome has to be that much, have the same degree of similarity to ours. We know that they're our closest cousin because of how similar they are, but there's no necessity for specific parts to be the same. As far as I mean, of course, there's probably obviously certain genetic parts that I'm not a geneticist that have to be the same, obviously. But with regards to this, I'm not sure, from what I know, which isn't much, obviously, in regards to genetics, how much there's a necessity for that to be the same. As for how that happened, I would say that going off of how we generally, those who are for evolution, explain evolution, there would be notions such as, this isn't surprising that it's different because, again, small changes, those would, the aggregate of which may cause such a difference.
I got a question.
But there would be environmental pressures.
I understand, Carlos, but the problem is small changes won't account for these size differences. Again, it's only half the size. Notice the gene content is totally different. Look at all this heterochromatin, this these densely packed pieces of DNA here. It comprising a lot of satellite DNA, repetitive DNA. Here in the human Y, you see in the gray, it's almost non-existent in your chimpanzee. Like, these are massive differences. And
I don't think he would understand.
We can say
need to take place.
We can say that those small changes won't allow for that, but that's supposing a certain sample size. So one thing I think that we tend to ignore is the massive amount of reproduction that is capable by a lot of organisms. You know what I'm saying? So yes, if you want to say, oh, this specific organism can only do it so much, but when we take into account the totality of how many organisms are reproducing in a generation, you know what I'm saying? Like, if we were just to look at today, I know today organisms are much different than they were back then, but if we were just to look today, an octopus gives birth to over 1,000 children. So even if you want to say the rate of change and variety is very small, with the sample size being that large, that's going to create a creature that's small, yes, but
right,
that's a creature that exists now evolved to have a smaller sample size. You know what I'm saying?
Well,
but Carlos, back then there was no necessary, it wasn't necessarily the case, because again, the ancestor being an amoeba, yes.
Well, Carlos, Donny, can I ask you something? Wouldn't that just mean that we have a common ancestor with gorillas if the X chromosome and the Y chromosome both are so similar?
Well, they do think the guys they share ancestry with gorillas.
Yes. How do you disprove that claim? If someone just shifts and says, "Oh, okay, we have not the chimpanzees as our closest common ancestors, but gorillas." So how would you answer to that claim?
I'm sorry. I don't think I'm following the question.
What Antangelo and Donny are saying is that if you look at this chart, the gorilla DNA is more similar to human than the chimps. So their question
yes, in that regard.
Yeah. So like, why are you guys drawing this this tree of evolution with a mismatching? It's a mismatching phylogeny tree. So it's
because that section of the DNA may be most similar to humans, but if you're looking at the totality, the chimpanzee outweighs it.
That's the question.
It's like saying, hey, you and I, our outfits, you know what I'm saying? We're wearing outfits, right? If we're wearing the same outfit, if we have three people, you, me, and Donny, and we're all wearing the same outfit, and you and I, most of our outfit is blue, but Donny and I both have a red suitcase.
Well, here's the thing.
And then you say that red suitcase is more similar than than your gray suitcase. Yes, but the entirety of our suit is more so similar than that suitcase.
Yeah, I get these analogies, but here's the thing. I know you're not a biologist, but what percentage of DNA do you think humans and chimps share?
I believe it was 98%, 98.7%, or 97.8%.
Well, that turns out to be false. This is actually very misleading data. Do you know how they get that 98%, 97%?
Well, let me jump in before you answer that, Carlos. I want to keep Carlos focused, because before we get to the entirety of the genome, I still think my point is being missed. Is yes, we could look to the entirety of the genome, okay? Mm-hmm. But even when we look at that, there's massive gaps, unalignable regions that aren't accounted for or looked at, size differences. Okay, it's a little messy, especially when you're looking at autosomal DNA. We have scrambling every generation. Okay, my point is the Y chromosome is less messy, it's more stable, and so it should be more similar humans and chimpanzees when we compare. This is a direct prediction of the separate ancestry model.
Can I ask why it would have to be more stable or more similar?
Because the Y chromosome is a smaller DNA compartment, just like the mitochondrial DNA. It lacks recombination. Carlos, do you know what recombination is?
Somewhat. I would say no, but from what I understand, it's the manner in which RNA or DNA convert into each other, and vice versa.
Well, you do have gene expression, the process by which a gene is turned on and off to produce an RNA product or a protein product. Okay, DNA transcribed in RNA translated into protein, the protein synthesis process. But recombination itself is basically every generation you have your chromosomes line up and they exchange genetic information with each other. That's why you are a mix, right?
That's the whole half my parents and half of each of my parents' chromosomes. Okay.
Exactly. So you're basically a shuffled mix of your parent, of your mom, 50%, and then your dad, 50%. Okay. But we also have the Y chromosome, and then we have the mitochondrial DNA, which is the powerhouse of the cell. It exists outside of the nucleus. Okay. The Y chromosome is also uniparentally inherited DNA. So rather than being biparentally inherited, where you get this process of recombination, where pre-existing DNA variants are shuffling every generation, the Y chromosome, you don't get that. And you get a little bit at the tip.
Yeah, because it's only from the father, correct?
Right, because the Y chromosomes are passed down on the father's side, paternally, you're right. And so they're less messy, they're easier to look at, they're easier to build a family tree through. And so hypothetically, they should be more stable. So it's a good DNA compartment to look at, okay? And both creationists and evolutionists can agree that the DNA differences that we find in the Y chromosome are actually due to mutations. When we look to autosomal nuclear DNA, creationists explain most.
I think I understand what your question is. I think I haven't answered your question. So you're asking why they would be so different when they kind of, because of how they go, they kind of necessarily have to be the same. I would say they're different because it would probably, in my opinion, most have to do with environmental pressures. I would say that while it does have to be stable, it may be the case that it changed so much due to the pressures that X population was under. And so at any given point, in order to, being that evolution is about which expressions survive or not survive, allow you to reproduce. The ones that were reproducing were probably the ones that had this difference or a diminishing difference. And it could be the case that it continued to diminish in this way.
But the issue with that is, and I go back to how homogeneous, very little diversity exists within human Y chromosome. So here's a human Y chromosomal phylogeny. Okay. And so this represents DNA variation worldwide. This is an unrooted tree. And these are Y chromosomes. And what we find is very little variation, very few DNA differences separating any two people. Again, the rate as to which the Y chromosome accumulates mutations every generation is fast. It's somewhere between 1 and 3, with only a few DNA differences separating any two people. Okay. It is very easy in biblical time to explain how that DNA variety can come about. So the point is, if you're saying environmental pressures might be a reason for the rapidly changing Y chromosome, well, even according to your own model, humans go back to an out of Africa bottleneck about 200,000 years ago, somewhere between 100 and 200,000 years ago. Okay, and through coalescence, that's how you explain the one Y chromosomal ancestor that we have. So why aren't human Y chromosomes more different? How come we don't find any really divergent people groups globally? We don't find that. And so if environment was dictating a rapidly changing Y chromosome, we should find a lot more differences in the human Y chromosome, but we don't. Then we bring in the chimpanzee Y chromosome and it's nothing alike. And I feel like these are just so stories, and I do appreciate your responses, but they're certainly not scientific, because you're going to have to present a highly sophisticated mathematical model, Carlos, to explain how in 6 million years you go from a Y chromosome that's basically the same to one that's only about 40% the same when you consider overall architecture, gene content, and size differences.
Well,
this is a major challenge. Go ahead, Carlos.
I would have to disagree on the basis of being that my point was about environmental pressures. It is important to highlight the fact that our evolutionary characteristic is our brains. So would you agree, Donny, that we can live in places that most animals generally would not be able to branch out to, simply on the basis of our intellect allows for a capacity of technology that allows us to endure such climates?
Yeah,
And
if
how
you're
did
talking
that?
about if you're talking about brain function, like right here, here's a paper from the conventional literature.
No. What I'm asking is, would you agree that because of how smart we are capable of living, of circumventing certain environmental pressures? Like, we can live in places that are too cold for humans to live without technology. Correct?
Well,
We can live in places that are too dry and dangerous, like, deserts, to be lived in by humans without technology,
well,
i.e., clothing, fire, tools. Correct?
right, through tools, fire
Okay,
making,
so
and
so
we
my point
understand this.
here,
Okay, go ahead.
Donnie, is that you cannot say that the environmental pressures works against my argument, because environmental pressures causes that difference for those other species, but we are so smart, essentially, that we circumvent those environmental pressures. What normally would happen, and this is a key point that I think a lot of creationists miss, is the impact that our intelligence has had on even evolution itself. Because we can look at dogs, for example, right? Like, people tend to say, why don't we see evolution, macroevolution happening nowadays? Why don't we see it in the lab? We could. I would argue we could. But first off, there's a lot of hurdles we'd have to jump through. If we brought up the notion of, like, just look at cloning. We can't even do cloning technically without the legal issues, that people have with morality and whatnot like that. So to say, hey, we're gonna take this animal and we're gonna put it in tests where we're forcing them to reproduce over and over and over until we get something different,
Well,
may
I'm going to
cause
jump in,
an
Carlos.
ethical issue that
Carlos, I'm going
societally
to
we
jump
may
in.
not
I
allow.
feel like you're ranting. You're not answering the question. We're going to leave it up to the audience. You have not
Sorry.
provided a single good reason as to why the Y chromosomes between humans and chimpanzees is so incredibly different. You haven't provided, and that's okay. You haven't read the paper.
I think I did. My answer is that
environmental
other
pressures
organisms.
is not going to change a Y
Hold on,
chromosome that much.
it's that other organisms are subject to environmental pressures and we aren't.
No. Environmental pressures
Wrong.
is not going to provide massive chromosomal rearrangements, okay, in the chimpanzee line. It's not going to alter the Y chromosome to the point where it's literally half the size, where apparently if chimpanzees and humans go back to a common ancestor 6 million years ago, the Y chromosome in the chimpanzee, it's essentially been broken off. It's only half the size. So a lot of the genes aren't even present in the chimpanzee that are present in the human Y chromosome. So the point is, the most parsimonious explanation for this challenge is the separate ancestry model. This is what we predicted. One Y chromosomal ancestor of all people. Okay. This is what we find in DNA. And the fact that humans and chimpanzees aren't related. And this is what we find in terms of the Y chromosome dissimilarity. And so I would just challenge you to go to the drawing board and provide a sophisticated mathematical model, not just, environmental pressures. Okay, I mean, you can believe that.
And sample size. It's not one thing. It's several factors, and I think trying to reduce it down to one specific factor is problematic.
So, if hypothetically, if the Y chromosomes of chimpanzees and humans was a lot more similar, what would you say? Let's say they were 90% the same. What would you say?
So I don't. Again, I'm not too exactly. You gave me a little rundown of what they do, but I'd have to look more exactly into what they do to exactly say, to give you an answer to that. So I don't want to dishonestly give you an answer.
I'm saying if they were highly similar, would you conclude common ancestry, similarity due to common ancestry?
I would say, again, probably not, because I don't think the fact that part is specifically similar or not matters. I think it's, again, the matter of totality, because that's generally what we look like.
Carlos, I got a question. Would you appeal to like different mutation rates to explain this away? Would you say the mutation rates were different?
Sorry.
I'm not sure. I would perhaps, maybe, from what I know now, maybe it could be the case that there are varying mutation rates in different organisms, and at a prior point in time, that may have been something that was prevalent. But I'm not sure too much, again, about what the mutation rates. I've heard that we can guess those mutation rates. So.
Well, I don't think there would be
or calculate them. My bad.
Actually, before you talk, Bubbles, I just wanted to. We got Theo who just joined. I'm not familiar with who Theo is, so I just have to vet him. Theo, can you quickly introduce yourself to the panel, just so I know that we're dealing with somebody legit. Theo, a real quick intro.
Yeah, I am Theophilus. I am a creationist.
Okay.
I love watching your channel. Hey, is this? I have some. I would like somebody to look up the 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 new discovery of about the Big Bang, about the Big Bang.
Okay. Theo, I appreciate it. We are currently discussing evolution and genetics, and so we're going to stick to that for now. But that's certainly a great topic, the Big Bang. So, Theo, feel free to stick around. I'm going to bring us back to the topic at hand. Carlos, I will say,
Pardon me. Sorry, Donny, sorry to cut you off. I just want to say, Donny, if you do have a debate about like physics and stuff like that at some point, let me know. I'd love to get in on that. Physics is such a fun topic.
I can debate physics with you.
Okay, so I'd like to bring us back to specifically Luca as the first hour with Luca versus
Donny, while you present your argument, I'll have breakfast because I'll go to work in very soon. I'll leave in 10-15 minutes max because I really need to. So
let me ask a question before you.
I did wait for you.
Well, hey, Bubbles, don't worry. You're going to get a chance, but I do want to give Luca the respect because he's been looking for an answer to the Iceman. And so I've got a couple responses, and feel free, everybody can get in on the fun.
Okay, just keep it short and don't hog the whole debate again. I know you're a debate hogger.
We want to stick to the actual topic of evidence for evolution. And as creationists, we need to stick to differentiating lines of evidence, okay? There's no sense in arguing all night about non-discriminatory lines of evidence. Notice how I brought the Y chromosome dissimilarity to the table, and it actually demonstrated the power of the separate ancestry model, because that is a line of evidence that only the separate ancestry model can explain. And we got a number of powerful lines of evidence.
I think that was a good question, being that I don't do biology much. So,
but you brought it up.
It's something I should look up. Well, no, I brought up Y chromosome.
You brought up you brought up Y.
His specific point is something I didn't know. I brought up the general understanding, the layman's understanding, because I know the layman's understanding. But I'm saying that his question was a good question because it's something for me to go and look at, because I didn't dig into that part of the biology again because I'm not into biology like that. So it's a good question for me to go and look into.
Well, you would be able to appeal to different mutation rates. That's one thing you can do with Christians.
Yeah.
Well, differing mutation rate is not going to account again for a 70% difference. Okay, varying. We already know that the mutation rate is high in the Y chromosome, and yet, according to the evolutionary model, they have 200,000 years for humans to accumulate mutations and novel genetic diversity in the Y chromosome. And guess what? The Y chromosomes of human men are extremely homogeneous and not heterozygous or heterogeneous. Okay, but if varying mutation rates in terms of some chromosomes have faster mutation rates, which is true. Okay, if that could explain the data, then the human Y chromosome should be more different than it is. And so that's not going to work either.
Well, Carl's going to...
Hey, Donny, I got a question for you. Donny, I got a question for you. Hey, on that paper I sent you on the sequencing of the Y chromosome, now that it's been totally sequenced, and this is a paper from August of this year, 2003, how much more difference would there be now than with the that it's been sequenced? And I think it said that there was 30 million new pairs added and 41 new protein-based genes. How would that now compare to the chimpanzee, the fallacy of the chimpanzee comparison, or the great ape, now that it's been sequenced?
Well, typically the better sequencing data you get over time, the more dissimilar and the more divergent these creatures get. And so I would argue with better Y chromosomal DNA data and sequencing technologies, it'd be an even bigger problem. But I find it funny because it doesn't even have to be a bigger problem for them, because already it's a massive problem. I think, as the audience could tell with the visual, the Y chromosomes between humans and chimpanzees they're nothing alike. I mean, the gene content's different, the size differences are different, the architecture is different.